Welcome to another Data Hurdles. I'm Chris Detzel, and
I'm Michael Burke. How you doing, Chris?
I'm good. How about you?
Good. It's been a while since we've done a podcast. I think we had a little bit of a hiatus there for 2 weeks or so. Happy to be back at it.
Yeah, it's exciting. And guess what? We have a guest today, Willem Koenders. Willem, how are you?
Yes, sir. I'm doing very well. How about you?
Well, I'm in Dallas, and it's going to be about 89 degrees today, so it's nice and cool here. So it's exciting.
It's dreadful where I'm in Washington, D.C. There's that.
Are you getting hit by a lot of rain right now? Is that right?
We were. I don't know if it's related to what's happening more south of us, but it is positively dreadful
Yeah.
anyway.
So, and Michael's close to, or he's in Massachusetts.
I just
Or
been the golf before this, so I had a great day. Played 9 holes, so I can't complain. Friday is a good day for me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and those kinds of things, and then we'll kick it off with our topic today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, Chris, you and I talked before, but I've worked for pretty much my entire career in data. I started out as a corporate strategist, but I very quickly realized the role that data plays for companies to sustain a competitive advantage. I had the good fortune to work with a great series of chief data officers that kind of learned me the ropes of how this works and what matters and how to do it. Spent time in the US, Latin America, Africa, Europe, Asia, actually, all either permanently just living there for a while or projects. And yeah, so now at CS Associates, I'm a global data strategy leader. So I lead a lot of consulting engagements around data advisory on everything from like the highest level data strategies down to rolled up sleeves implementation of different programs and projects. But as you noticed today, it's also just my passion. So I'll talk about it and I'll read about it in my free time as well and talk to guys like you. Yeah, good to be here.
Pretty awesome. One of the things that we want to talk about, and I've sometimes it gets controversial around this topic around data mesh. And one of the CDOs, and Michael can attest to this, that we talked to a few weeks ago, a month ago, was like, he just didn't believe in data mesh at all. And the reason is because he felt he doesn't know one person or one company that's using it, doing it, never seen some use cases. And he goes, he can need to talk about this. But so would love to get your take one and walk us through what, the concept of data mesh, how does it differ from like traditional data architectures and data lakes and data warehouses and things like that?
Yeah, for sure. For me, maybe just to start off with, what is it to begin with?
Yeah.
For me, the data mesh to me, if I just see like a net, like an actual net with threads, like appear in my mind with like strategic data in there. And then we know how to make that strategic data available internally or externally, but in any case to those people that truly need it. And at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. It really a very strong concept, a concept that very strongly relates to is this idea of domain-driven software engineering, domain-driven governance of data, right? So that instead of you having this, you just mentioned it yourself, right? The data lake or data warehouse, like being very focused on having this big container or this big platform where you get all the data. It's really not about that. It's really about connecting the dots, right? Creating that net across the organization. And for me, and maybe some listeners may take offense to this, it's a little bit less about the technology sometimes. Like for me, it doesn't matter as much what cloud native architecture, if any, it really is on. For me, the part that I'm looking at more is the governance around it. Is like kind of how do you mobilize it? What are the concept, the roles, responsibilities? How do you maybe change different people who already have roles in organizations to be more aligned to this type of data democratization? At least that's for me. And I think sometimes like where some of the challenges come from, and I don't know the respective CDO you spoke to, right? But it's like sometimes over promises it. Right? Here's the mesh, here's your data. Next quarter, it will all be there. It's not there, right? That's not how it works. There's a lot of hard work that will come with it. Things like data ownership and et cetera. So probably that may have something to do with it.
Yeah. Why do you think it's gained so much traction? And what are some of the challenges that are being addressed with it?
One of the main reasons is that the quality of data is still a problem. We've talked about this for decades and depending on the company in the sector and the industry, but like the quality and the availability of data remains a problem that has several reasons. One, again, ties back to these data lakes and data warehouses where the technology at that point of time just seemed to advocate for a centralized kind of provisioning of that technology. And like a lot of companies, even they know that they might create a data swamp, it's just too tempting to pump it in there. And so I think that's just like a big part of the reason
Wait,
why
did you just say data swamp?
I may have.
Man,
I know.
so many different terms. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah. And so if that's the case, then carving some of that data up by domains and starting to drive ownership instead of indeed like dumping everything in this swamp where there's nobody really owning it, like that's actually one of the key reasons. And so this driving of ownership is almost one of the, it's not even necessarily for me the interoperability technology that most people think about of data mesh that is so foundationally potentially transformative. It's that ownership, right? That you now have technology that matches that other governance prerogative that you have to this consideration to drive ownership on a domain basis. That I think is very important. And then why does it gain traction even more so maybe now? Well, we've got yet another technology wave, right? Now it's Gen AI. It was something else before. We quickly want all of this data to be available, queried to help these use cases. But guess what? It's still not there and available. So that just keeps building.
Can you give me some examples? Because I actually think that to me, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree, I feel like this is the tabs versus spaces debate. Programming, these cultural ways of setting up process are what are differentiating these frameworks. To me, a lot of it, right, is just about how you're thinking about process and control and communication. When you're implementing as a practitioner a data mesh into a company that you're working with, if you have a dysfunctional company that's really struggling with some of these fundamental challenges, how do you go about remediating that? Or what are your recommendations? Because having gone through this a few times with different companies, right, in these transformations, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes they work really well and everybody takes to them. There's an alignment, but many times it falls apart. And I'm always curious for somebody on your side of the table who's coming into these environments and you need to come up with these plans for transformation. What steps do you take?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe a couple of things that come to mind for me is maybe the how and the where a little bit. And so maybe let's talk about the how a little bit first. So data mesh again, almost by definition is domain driven, right? You will not, even the most leading companies will not ever, have a functional data mesh across each of all of their domains at the same level. There's also no business case for that, right? So there's something about actually identifying the domains and figuring out what's the 1, 2, 3 key ones to start out with, because that other domains will need to consume the data from that. It's a very cliche recommendation, but it's true, right? Start small, figure it out. What are the 2 or 3 main ones? But then no matter which domain, whether it's the first one or the 7th one, to have some sort of a playbook. And I think with data mesh and just like other data governance concepts, it's very easy to make it extraordinarily complicated, to have a lot of different rules, to very lot of tech speak in there. Like, what's actually the playbook here? What would you do? What is definition around what a product or an asset is? What is the data owner? What do they do? And then a role and responsibilities in 3 or 4 bullets, not 25, right? What are the key things that you really need to think about, and how do you enable them? I think those are 2 of these kind of, if I know where I'm going to do it and how I'm going to do it, that already gives me 2 tools. And now across this, have some sort of portfolio view of progress. Like, can I see how many nodes I have in this data mesh? How many like functional certified data assets and products I have, where I'm very strict in the beginning around the business case. Like, how do I calculate the ROI? Very tough thing to do for data. Like, how do you drive the revenue uplift or the cost decrease and risk mitigation? But if you have a view of a portfolio of 3, 4, 5 very well functioning data assets or products, you'll notice that the rest of the company wants to have part of that too. That's at least a pattern that we've seen. Some of the companies that are able to have a good start and then take it from there.
That's great. Yeah, I've noticed too that like in larger organizations, it's so interesting because the bigger the organization, as you try to make some of these transformations, they take a lot of time and buy-in from a lot of different departments, right? And even when you start small and implement some of these use cases, it can be really challenging to toe the line, even if you do have success to pull the rest of the organization along. How do you see the long-term, more proactive steps of implementing a data mesh, right? Because I'm assuming a lot of your customers are fairly big customers, right? So this could be a 5 to 10 year transformation for some of these larger organizations if they're really working towards a centralized kind of unified system.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's just having a view or a backlog of what these products or assets are really helps. And to be very deliberate about early on, what are these kind of logical clusters of data that can eventually be turned into an asset or a product, and to have a deliberate effort to schedule them out and to deliberately say yes or no to them. That really helps, at least from what I've seen, so that you have this portfolio that I mentioned earlier, not just across the data assets and products that are live and like generating value right now, but to also have it about like up and coming. Here's what's coming for this year. Here's what's coming next year. You can compare it to, some people use a supermarket example, others use different ones. Like some of the shelves are still empty, but there's a little sign up there and saying, this is coming this year. That
Yep.
for me at least helps to be proactive about it, to help the resourcing. And as long as you're like very early on, very deliberate about both ownership, like who actually owns this? It's someone's job to represent this product or asset once it's prioritized. And then two, for that specific person to be very deliberately articulating the business case. It's where in the longer term, that should eventually find its way to the shelves. May have some reprioritization as we go, but that's at least where you can go. And just now we went through it last week in a workshop with, let's say, globally leading technology company. And we had a list of probably 30, 40 critical data sources that eventually they would need. And what we eventually did is we like created this heat map of sorts. What are these critical assets and products? What are the use cases across them? And then we picked 5 eventually that would be able to drive, was a little over 20 of these use cases, almost just these 5. And so that's a way to be very powerfully saying this will have to be done in the next year if you truly want to be serious about those things that you actually already say in your business strategy.
I have a question real quick. Sorry, Mike.
No, that's good.
But I'm trying to envision this, right? As it's just a practical person that's not like your hardcore data person that talks about meshes and swamps and things. So is that kind of, again, what does this mean in real life as a business owner? So for example, and I'm just making this up, but let's say, your data teams have all this data in a centralized way, but then we're using the data in our own ways as a business. So marketing has some stuff. This team over here has some stuff. And can you talk about that in like real life, how somebody like me would understand that? Because I'm trying to understand it better.
Yeah, for sure. So if I take a real example that maybe probably exists in 90% plus more of industries, is if you take a domain like customers, right? The customer or patients or accounts or whoever you're serving, like it tends to be the case that type of data is required throughout the organization because, for example, if you have a call center or some sort of communicational team, they need to be able to call them up and have accurate information to talk to them about whatever products or services they have in the past or are still buying from you. Like you need to have that available somewhere as an example. So what you'll get to is like in a domain like customer or again, patient or whatever it ends up, whatever your equivalent to that is that becomes one or several assets. They tend to be tied to an operational platform like a CRM or an MDM, something like that. Like if you think about that as a product is now, if I'm in the operational processes or part of the business or function in the organization that creates or changes this data, how do I now do this with keeping in mind the actual use cases that are using this? So I have a quantified understanding of, hey, if the marketing team doesn't have an email address, they can't actually run this campaign. And so that campaign is set to drive $500 million of possible revenues. So like they don't have to be precise, actually. As long as the magnitude is roughly okay, then you'll be fine in terms of driving it as a product. That's one example of probably the most common or the clearest example of starting as a product. Now, the nice part is that all the domains depend on each other. It's not the case that you have 2 or 3 domains who are serving all the others. There's a reciprocal nature to this. And that's, I think, like where the same thing as everybody in a stadium keeps sitting, everybody has a great view. Same thing here is everybody lives up to their own responsibility. You get in a very nice environment of being able to truly exchange data. Now, it sounds easier saying this on a podcast like this, like we just talked about it, that's rough. You have ownership, people are busy, systems may be old and all of these things, but that's at least the thinking behind it. And so that you truly own that. Now, we can take any sort of analogy, right? The kitchen is used a lot, right? So that you're a chef, you're trying to build stuff, or you're trying to create dishes and create the food. Somebody's in charge of giving you the carrots or the onions, right?
Yep.
That's effectively how it's all about, right? So everybody's you're creating something for someone else, and you want to do it up to a set of standards that you have very clear. Like in a real world example, like that's what it's about. You give me the sector, I'll give you some thoughts on, how it could be, but that's effectively how it will work.
I think the really interesting thing, Chris, is that it's not just getting all the data together for customer, right? It's what is the customer count, like aligning on the KPIs, what meal tastes good for the kitchen analogy, right? Like the whole business has to align behind these definitions, which almost always there's ambiguity and people are reporting out those numbers differently. It's always happening, right? Like you'd think there would be one customer count or one revenue number, but there's not.
I remember this guy, Joe DeSantos. He was at the time the CDO at Click, but then now he's moved to Workday. But he said, when I was at Click, there's like 5 different departments that thought about customer. And we all thought, oh, one person was like on the account level and one team was on the contact level. But he goes, we had 5 different views of what a customer was. We had to define that first. Nobody knew, or they knew what they thought the customer was, but none of us had the same definition. So it's a good point.
I love, Michael, what you said about like the analogy here about with the kitchen. If I may pull that a little bit further, is it's not just about knowing the dishes that they want to make. There's also realization, and this is very core to thinking about it as a product, is like products of this year may not be the products of next year, right? Like cars and whatever clothing, it all changes, and so does data. And so in this kitchen analogy, maybe it's vegetarian dishes that this particular company needs to start serving up, or maybe they have a particular ingredient that no longer works for them, or there's the carbohydrates need to be taken out. Whatever it is, like that is very relevant to data as well, especially also customers, right? Their demands are changing absolutely rapidly. Also privacy concerns, how they want to be addressed, also like that, like being able to have an active, like product oriented process around this is critical. It is, I would say, it's no longer enough to say, I'm going to invest $5 or $10 million in a CRM platform and I'm done. That is just not how it works. There's just what data are you actually interested in? What's the data model behind it? What are the business requirements on that? And making sure that you keep track of them as well as time passes.
So another really interesting question I have, and I love the kitchen analogies, but when we go into some of the more complicated pieces of data mesh, like governance, as an example, right? From at least my perspective, and I haven't done a ton with data mesh, but I have done some work. Governance becomes something that's really challenging, right? Because you essentially are giving ownership of data to the organizations or the subsets of organizations within your business. But then you're also trying to bake in things like self-service or governance. And how does that work? Like when you go into a large organization, how would you implement governance that was done so in a meaningful way, where there is still some layer of control over who has access to what and how that's being audited?
Yeah, for sure. And then maybe first recognizing that there's different types of governance even, right? So there's governance around security of the data, which is an example of where you actually want to continue to be pretty strict. Like you do not want to, because a lot of domain driven teams will not have, definitely not initially, the same maturity across the entire stack. So that's going to be one that you are going to want to have a common kind of processes and protocols around that. However, like giving access would be something you would have the domain team do, for example, right? So that's the example of where that one's actually fairly standard and probably people won't fight over as much. Like the governance around the quality of data is much harder. And so that's where like a cultural change may be required as well. There may be a case where a central team maybe finally had some standards in place, some control, and they're now almost told to let go. That's no longer a problem. That's now going to these domain-driven teams. That's something you need to address. You talk about like how it works, why it works like that. But on the receiving end, it's actually almost the inverse image of a similar kind of culture change that requires. Like a lot of people might be longing for it because the data has been not up to what they've been looking for, but more commonly, once you actually try to find owners, like a lot of business teams, I've heard it so often, just give me access to the data. That's not really how it works. That's one part of the reciprocal relationship. Like who's on the other end, like actually owning it. And so when you're trying to find an actual individual who signs up for I own it, that is hard. And so that is something where a lot of things you can fill the remainder of the hour with this, right? Like how you can work on that type of transformation. But a lot of things come down to helping them understand that it's actually not a new responsibility, right? It's maybe you didn't know that you were already in charge of making sure that the data was protected and you didn't do anything strange or unlawful with it. That was already a responsibility of yours all along. We're just going to ask you to do it a little bit more formally. And then the other bit is its enablement. You cannot just, I've seen that too. Hey, here's a new set of policies and standards and good luck. And that doesn't work. You have to help them. Like after that playbook I mentioned earlier, what are those key 2-3 things? And really 2 or 3 things, not 10 or 15. What are those key few things? And ideally, how can we tech enable do this? Like please do not get into any manual lineage efforts anymore, or manual efforts to write data quality rules. There's tooling who can do this now. So help them do that. Help give them the tools to quickly take the first strides.
I feel like it's just so complicated. And like when you think of, so as let's say a business, if I own some of that data or whatever, but all these, if I'm new to an organization and I come in, there's all these things that I'm gonna have to do to try to get data. Like I'm at an organization today and I'm building something brand new and I'm gonna need all this data. First, I gotta figure out where to go, who does what. And there's 5 people that do these things. And I'm like, I don't like, I need to I just need a list of these kind of customers. Where's that at? It's hard to get. I was like, why is that hard to get? I should be able to know. And maybe that helps once you start having this data mesh is you have this centralized area that has the data, but then there's these different owners. Like for me, I have to create my own stuff. I have to hire out a company to do this. It feels complicated going into these somewhat big organizations. I can't imagine a $50 billion organization or something massive to do some of this stuff. Setting that up seems very difficult. And at first, anyways, at a massive organization. Then 2 is if you're new, maybe that actually helps. I don't know.
And as a part of like I guess the experience you're describing, it sounds like you have a fun time or have had a fun time while you enter. But there's a part in here that we haven't really mentioned yet that if you do it right, a data mesh can really becomes hand in hand, namely some sort of marketplace or catalog of the data, right? Again, not all data everywhere, but across that net that we now start to build across the company. What are those key nodes? What are the key cities, let's say, on this neighborhood map? And what are the directions to get there? At the end of the day, that's where you want to get. But like before, if you go to any of the vendors, and maybe sometimes we do this ourselves too, like in the demo, that looks very easy, right? Here's the asset and the products, double click, order, add it to my cart, and boom, here it is, right? Behind the scenes, all these things we just talked about do need to come together, right? So what data is it? You have an owner in place that has made sure that it's fit for purpose. Do you have a data access process in place to check that the respective parties should have access to it? Does that access process itself not take 3 months to get through? Because a lot of companies, counterintuitively, who had a lot of success on the technical side of enabling this data democratization, now are getting a push from their privacy and legal organizations saying, ho, ho, right? We now have PHI, PII, a lot of privacy concerns and maybe a breach or 2. And you actually have to go back and figure out how do I factor all that in? So, yeah.
So what do you think as you look at, so you mentioned some case studies, and if you want to mention another 1 or 2, it'd be really good. But how do you know and how do you measure like positive business impact and what are the outcomes? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, for me, that's just for me, the most dominant way to go about it is that portfolio of assets. It has to be that. So you may have seen that like online, talked about another analogy. Here we go. But now to like real estate folks. So if you want to contrast and compare how you can drive value off of kind of data assets, it's maybe something a little bit vague, right? But if you think about real estate, like a company's office buildings, train stations, it's much easier, like to think about what you need to do for them to be fit for purpose and to drive value. Namely, they need to have an owner. They're going to be dilapidated. Like nobody's going to care if you can't get the profits out of them. You need to have people who are in charge of the quality, roughly. Not like you don't have to like clean every hallway every day, but you need to do enough, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were to compare something like that to a data mesh type of organization where you're going to start seeing these nodes in the net, it's those nodes that drive the value, right? So those nodes by definition should be managed and designed as a product. They have value statements and analysis against them. And that's the story that, at least in the examples that I've seen, you can most powerfully tell. So compare that to, I've tried to do this too in past years. I invested $2 million in said data catalog tool, or $1.5 million in this data quality tool. What actually was the ROI? Very tough to do. It is a totally different story to say, now this kind of landscape to that together, we have 17, I'm just making it up, right? Data assets or products, which are tied to 32 use cases. And each of these have an owner, right? So the assets and products do, and the use cases do. And so the use cases have value statements that should be cumulative, where you can say, hey, these 17 assets and these 32 use cases jointly drive over $1 billion of revenue. They have helped to decrease 300 million in costs. They've removed over 100,000 manual steps. That's the type of story you want to tell. You don't want to talk about the net or the nodes. You want to talk about the strategic data and the use cases. That's also the most fun, right? Because that's when you actually get to the business side or the functional side of the organization. You're going to have very kind of engaging conversations about, tell me truly what's going to change if we do this data better. And I think it's the fun part actually as well. I think maybe there's an opportunity for a lot of very savvy people to get out of that buried back office kind of operations or data team and like truly get out there in the wild with the people who actually sell the products and services and interact with the customers.
Chris, I'll give you a fun story too. When I was working a lot with sales reps, right? This was one of the hardest problems. Sales reps, they have the opportunity to provide you some of the best quality data ever, but they don't normally do it because they're not incentivized to do it. And I worked really hard to build a strategy, because all of my work that I was doing for this one marketing and sales campaign using AI required high quality sales data. It required BDs to put information into Salesforce. So we started actually coming up with an accreditation program where we went to the top of the funnel and said, okay, if you get high quality data and we're able to make a conversion based off of that data using AI, we'll accredit some of that to you. And that was one way that then everybody at the front line was like, oh, okay, we're going to actually get something out of doing all of this. But it is really hard to weave those lines between different organizations that are incentivized by completely different things. Most people don't really care about that quality of data. They should, but it's not their priority. They're not getting compensated on it. And so they're not going to. Why would they? Right.
Love the example. I think another thing, that two things that come to mind is just having a passionate kind of positive mentality about like, how am I trying to drive this change? That I don't know how you did it. That's like, how can you be creative and try to make a change? That's almost the like secret, not so secret ingredient behind a lot of this data management work that is otherwise so dull, because it just happens to be. And the second part is process discipline as well, right? You cannot solve for that. AI can't either yet. And so I love your example as well, because like you just find a very original way to fix the process discipline, right? Like where it's actually being created, because like garbage in, garbage out.
So if I'm starting out, I'm going to a big organization and I want to start thinking about implementing a data mesh concept and actually do it. Help me understand, where should we start? Where do we go? What do we do?
Couple of things. Like first, I would try and figure out, are people already bought into it or not? Like literally the highest level of what is it or not. If they are, great. You can go to step 2 and be a little bit more tactically around the next steps. But if they are not, like, let's just make sure that we establish the business case here. Like a little bit the chat we've had here, have that one with the right people in the organization. And this is not yet another governance heavy type of program with like uncertain benefits. Like there's something that should truly help you. And if it doesn't, then almost like just talk about why not. What are the things that are or not working, and how could data mesh help you? That may be first. Second, you get a little bit more into the logistics, the tactical like steps around this. Depends obviously enormously. Do you have certain technology regionally spread, those types of things? But I would come back to some relatively simple depiction of what does this mean for us? Like when we say data mesh, what are the components that are in here, and how does that translate to some sort of reference architecture of sorts? Because the whole point of, at least in my maybe simplified interpretation, is like, how can we make sure we almost start speaking some of the same language everywhere, right? And like, So what are those languages? And even if you pick 2 or 3 languages, what are then the different translators between them? Having a single page that kind of is able to summarize, hey, we store our data in each of these 5 or 6 types of buckets or containers. These are the 3 or 4 key interoperability pipelines. That really helps. If it's a menu of sorts, if anyone now wants to start building something new, take a look at the menu. And if there's something not on there that should be, okay, we'll have a conversation, but typically it tends to be there.
Chris, I think also you should think really long and hard about what value are you going to be providing all these other people that you're coming to ask for data for, right? Like the best data people that I've ever seen are incredible salespeople, right? They know how to trade priorities to get things done because at the end of the day, everybody has their own initiatives. I think
Let's need a
that's why,
report, dude.
yeah,
Let's just need a report.
exactly.
Send it
And
to me.
that's why I believe that companies like ZS come in and they do such a fantastic job is that they bring in an authority figure to come work with multiple stakeholders and find alignment in the sequence of work that makes people happy and gets things done. And that is really hard. That's a full-time job. Most people don't realize how much negotiation just for you to get marketing data or sales data into your platform or whatever you're building, that's really challenging, right? And that's a lot of work on both sides to set something like that up. And they have 2 years of roadmap, right? Every one of those departments has 2 years of roadmap that you're competing against to get that data.
Are there specific industries, Willem, that you look at and say, these are the ones that are doing more of the data mesh stuff than another? Or is it just all across the board?
I think it's pretty much across the board. There's definitely like levels of maturity in there. So like I spent a ton of time in financial sector a long time back. They've done it for years. And they called it something else before, just data mesh. Because like a lot of the concepts are similar and things like that. I spent a ton of time, for example, now in medical technology, like they're starting now. Like to like for them, it was in the past, just taking 2 examples, like having a great product sufficed. Like that was just leading. A lot of their growth just came from acquisitions, like mergers and acquisitions even. And so like having a fantastic product was just what drove growth. That's changing now because the products just to give you a specific example, the products that they put out there actually themselves start producing data. So that becomes something to take into account, but also like across these different product portfolios, like the customers and accounts become much savvier as well to figure out negotiations. And so these companies now need to start, their commercial organization needs to be served with the right data around what are actually our products that we have, what are the pricing strategies, what is a very complicated customer landscape in terms of negotiation groups, the hospital, the healthcare practitioners. Like they now recognize not having invested in that in years past, that they need to have these data assets and products in specific areas. And through that are finding their way to data mesh being the enabler, the foundational enabler.
Something that Mike always says when you look at engineers and architects and things like that, a lot of times they're working on their own silos and doing their own things. And it's just not really, they don't work well together necessarily. And Mike, keep me on if I'm wrong, but I've heard you say that several times. But how do you see that role of the data engineers, architects, product managers, et cetera, evolving in that data mesh environment? They don't already work greatly together. Is there some things that you see changing or?
I think so. A couple of things that would come to mind, like you may actually have a defined role that becomes more stronger, like a chief architect of sorts, like where you have an actual role across everything. One of your job descriptions is going to be to drive the consistency and the coherence across the different domains. I always love the connection with like broader non-data kind of enterprise architecture as well. It's a very often neglected connection to make because the enterprise architecture is very strong connection with business ownership and all of that. Then lower level, like I would say like more granular roles that are out there, them starting to think about data as a product here as well. So you may have they might not actually become the data owner or the data asset owner. That tends to be someone who leans towards or sits in or reports to the business or the function, but they still need to think about that as a product. It's no longer anymore, I do pipelines in, I don't know, a power center or something like that. There needs to be, how do the things that I'm putting together contribute to this becoming the best product that I can deliver to my consumers or customers? And from that perspective, also a little bit less gatekeeping a particular system or technology to enabling self-service. Again, that's what it's really all about, right? So if we take that another step further, then things like specific automation technology, orchestration engines, I guess a certain awareness of cloud native architecture as well, just become very helpful as well. Depends a little bit on the stack you choose, but those are not new to the engineers. And I think from a perspective of enabling the mesh, something that will become very helpful to them.
Yeah, I love what you said there. And Chris, I have used that term a lot, probably more than I should, about data and engineers working together. But what it really is comes down to the same thing. It's communication on goals and KPIs, right? The engineer is building features. Why should they add in tracking telemetry data? Why should they worry about machine learning offsets and how the changes in their code base are going to affect something in the data space? And in successful companies, what I've seen is exactly that, right? If you have really good alignment on your goals, really good communication on what you're trying to accomplish, and you work together, you're not siloing your KPIs, you're not siloing the attribution of those KPIs. You don't have grandstanders pulling up their one highlighted project. You get to this point where you build trust and everybody wants to see you succeed. But that,
It's hard.
unfortunately, is hard to do, right? It's really hard to build that trust within an organization, especially if there's been past tensions.
It sounds like you are listening into my program right now. That is exactly where you have a very strong initial enterprise technology company. Like they are set on bringing some of these things to the business. The business has been frustrated with the past couple of years, have invested in some of their own resources that have these types of skills. Now it's not working. It's not been working. So we're coming in to help try to figure out how can we find a way forward in here. And you have to, what you saying that there's no trust because the business folks, the commercial IT organizations cannot operate without the operation, the platforms and the corporate data, enterprise data that the enterprise technology company organization would look after. But also like very specifically, like there's methodologies out there, that help you work together in a cross-functional squad or whatever you call it, right? You create the epics, the user stories, where people actually report to different bits in the organizations, but are brought together in a kind of in a different team under the, let's say, the supervision of a product owner. But like for the actual current leaders to fully buy into that is a leap of faith in a lot of different times. So
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. And it's so hard. It's so hard to get there. But when it happens, it's magical, right? It's this like incredible, like movement happens at a rate that you'd never see anywhere else. And whether you're using data mesh is a great framework. I think that I'm agnostic on frameworks, but I think that when you have that communication and that trust and that responsibility deviated in a way that's effective, it's incredible. And Chris, honestly, going back to community where you are, like, look at what you're really doing. You're building trust between customers and you're providing them education so that they can do more on their own and they can feel more connected to your product. In the same way, like when you have high quality data, you're doing the same thing as internally. You're bringing people together, you're connecting them, you're allowing them to accomplish their goals faster and on their own. And that's really like a big, I think, differentiator between how a lot of people view data, which is a tool to answer questions. And that normally becomes much more of a siloed environment, which is where all these frameworks break down, right? And why I think they get a bad rep and a good rep.
So speaking towards the future, both Willem, Michael, whatever, what does the future hold for data mesh? Do we expect it to become like this dominant data architecture for big organizations or something else?
Mike, are you first or me?
Look, to me, these problems are never going to go away, right? Because inherently they're driven by culture. They're not driven by technology or code or languages. Yeah. So like anything else, if your company has the right culture and the right trust, you will find whether it's data mesh or another framework, a successful way to operate. But if you don't have that, even AI, like nothing is going to fix these problems.
Yeah. I think for me, some of it is about the definition, maybe of exactly what is or is not a data mesh. I sometimes hear examples of alternatives, but then I hear all these components like domain-driven ownership, interoperability. I guess data mesh to me might not be, but like those. If we talk about data mesh in a slightly looser interpretation, again about domain-driven software engineering, domain-driven governance, like having the most strategic data be discoverable across your organization and accessible, subject to a set of standards and enablers, then yeah, I think that is the dominant way that especially larger and more complex organizations, you will have to adopt something like that. Doesn't mean that your entire organization and every team and every subdomain will need it. I think it's probably more often than not, like less than a third of the domains that really need it. There's a couple of others that you're probably perfectly fine, maybe with a centralized team or even a platform-based team. But like, I think the larger and complex organizations will naturally kind of evolve towards this type of technology and pattern. My hope is that what will change is how some of the tooling that we have is going to make that a little bit easier still. Because some of the bottlenecks for data mesh, again, it's not pipelines, right? It's not the being able to store the data. Like there's some of the bottlenecks are still like, do I know what data I have? Have I quality controlled it? It's things like that where it's almost, I don't want to bring the buzzword back in, but like where something like Gen AI can really help, right? Sometimes getting you the definitions, some of the workflows, automate them. I just hope that will make this easier and more attainable also for companies that don't have 10, 20, $30 million budgets to try out how it could work.
Data mesh isn't a buzzword.
Yeah, I guess too. Yeah.
Uh, Did we miss anything? Did you want to touch on something that we just missed, or do you feel like we covered what we needed to cover today?
I think so. Yeah. I'm curious what people's responses would be and if they feel that it was helpful, if there's like particular practical. Michael, you raised a couple of them from your examples, but I'm curious if there's any others. But no, I think from my perspective, this is the kind of some of the key trends and some, at least the things that keep me passionate about this.
No, it's
And
great. Go ahead, Mike.
and I was just going to say, if you're a data fabric fan, we want to hear about it in the comments. Let's
In the comments, we'll post it on LinkedIn and you can comment and tell us what you think. So thank you for coming to another Data Hurdles. Please rate and review us. I'm Chris Detzel, and
Michael Burke. Thanks for tuning in.
thanks, Willem.
All right. Thank you guys.